In today's lesson, we are going to continue to look at different ways to collect primary data, and specifically, we're going to be looking at effective surveys. So we've already looked at sampling, we've looked at observations and experiments, and again, now we're going to be looking at surveying. So as a warm-up, in 2016, the Canadian government commissioned a statistics company to create a survey on Canadian opinions with respect to the government. 15 million households received an invitation to complete the online survey, and 383,074 responses were received. The survey results can be found at mydemocracy.ca. And the following slides are just going to look at a couple of the questions that were contained or were included in the survey. So you can answer each question and provide a reason why you think, but I want you to really just read the question and just think about them, because we'll come back to them. For the first one, is it better for several parties to have to govern together than for one party to make all the decisions, even if it takes longer for government things to get done? Strongly agree, somewhat disagree, neutral, somewhat agree, strongly agree. Is there anything wrong with that question? Or answer the question and think about how the question is worded. Next one. A party that wins the most seats in an election should still have to compromise with other parties, even if it means reconsidering some of its policies. Disagree. It's not, again, same kind of responses or response options. Number 3, governments should have to negotiate their policy decisions with other parties in Parliament, even if it is less clear who is accountable for the resulting policy. Read the question. What would you answer? Or just think about the question. There should be parties in Parliament that represents the views of all Canadians, even if some are radical or extreme. And then again, the same responses. And finally, the last one, which best describes your views? Canadians should have the option to cast their ballots online in federal elections, even if the security or privacy of online voting cannot be guaranteed. Or B, Canadians should continue to vote using paper ballots at a polling station, even if it is less accessible for some voters. So I want you to think, going back over those questions, do any of them have flaws in them, yes or no? Are there any issues in those questions? And there are some issues, right? But I want you to go back and read through the questions and see if you can find any flaws. Right? If not, wait till after the lesson. Then once we're through, go back and take a look at them. So there is bias in collecting data, and when creating surveys, it is important that the true beliefs of individuals being sampled are measured. Now, it's impossible to eliminate all bias when doing surveys or basically when looking at anything, but you want to try to reduce as much of it as possible, right? That's our goal. We want to not eliminate bias because, again, we said it's impossible, but we want to reduce as much as possible. Measurement bias, right? So measurement bias, we talked about it previously, exists when there is some flaw in the measurement tool, or in our case, a survey. And we're going to look at a couple of examples of how we could have flaws in a measurement tool, right, or in our survey. We could have a leading question, and a leading question is a question that influences the response. So for example, since cars pollute the environment, right, that's a leading question. That's influencing your opinion in some way, right? I don't think anyone would like to pollute the environment or encourages polluting the environment. So leading off with telling us that cars do that kind of influences us in a way. A loaded question, right? A question that assumes something about the respondents, right? What do you love about rhythmic gymnastics? It's a loaded question because if you answer it, then it's assumed that you like rhythmic gymnastics. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but maybe that's not your opinion. A double-barreled question, a question that asks about more than one issue, but only asks for one response. So for example, ask for more than one issue, but only asks for one response. How important is the time spent brushing and the number of brushes per day, right? If you're talking about brushing your teeth, right? That's two issues there, the time and the number of times, right? So how long you spend, the length of time, and the quantity, I guess you could say, right? But it's only asking for kind of one response. So you say if you say it's important, what are you referring to? If you say yes, are you talking about the number of brushes or the time spent brushing, right? So it's a double barrel question. So those are some examples of how we can have some measurement bias within the survey, or how our survey can be flawed, right? And it all comes down to how we ask our questions. So as an example, something that I want you to try on your own, just to kind of get used to it, right? Write 2 survey questions that would be given to teenagers with regards to listening to music. One question with some bias and one question with minimal bias, right? So basically take the kind of questions or the types of bias that we looked at previously, and then see if you can use that type of bias to come up with a question. Response bias, right? So response bias, we did talk about that. It's a type of measurement bias where the surveyed individuals were influenced to answer in a certain way. Right? And again, we talked about this, if the survey is not anonymous, right? Or because they thought they had to answer in a certain way. Right? So examples could be, does anyone have any questions about the content? Right? Because it's not anonymous, right? You have to raise your hand and basically saying out loud in front of the class, oh, I don't know what's going on. I don't know what we're doing. Sometimes that can be intimidating, right? You don't want to be that person that doesn't understand what's going on, especially if you think everyone else does, right? If it was anonymous and you just had to kind of submit like a vote or a paper ballot and no one knew that it was you, right? You might be more inclined to respond truthfully. If you thought you had to answer a certain way, right? How awesome of a teacher do you think Mr. Lou is, right? Maybe you feel you have to answer a certain way. You don't want to be judged later throughout the course, right? You don't want to your truthful answer to impact your mark in any way, so you answer how you think you need to answer. Right? And those are just some more silly examples, but hopefully at least it covers the idea. So when designing a survey, there are types of questions that you can include, right? And there are many types of questions you can include in a survey, right? You should have a variety of different types, right? There should be a variety of different types of questions so that the true beliefs are measured, right? If you only stick to one type of question, you might not get the full true opinions of the respondents, right? So you want to vary the questions, you want to include different types, and it makes the survey a little bit more interesting as well. Right? So there is an article in the online platform that looks at different types of questions and the examples, and there's quite a few of them, but I do recommend that you take a look at the article for those different types of questions. Some tips for good survey questions, right? Just in general, right? Be neutral, right? Don't boast too much about your products or services or about what you're dealing with, right? That kind of goes hand in hand with those kind of influence questions, right? Keep it simple. Create questions that are easy to understand and answer. Don't ask just because you can, right? You might not want to be overly intrusive, right? So maybe you don't ask for a lot of personal detail. Now, in some cases, you may need some of that, right? You may need to know the age, the gender, orientation, race, income level, political views, right? Things like that. You might need to know that depending on what the survey is. But if you don't, then don't ask just because you can, right? Ask only if it's important to what you're doing or what your question is or what you're trying to observe. Skip hypothetical questions, right? So try to avoid asking about situations that's something that you'll never come across or that respondents will never come across. This question, or find out how, right? So captures detailed data, or how this question captures detailed data and can generate more actionable information, right? So think about, okay, if I'm asking this question, how can I use it, right? What data am I going to be collecting from this? And ask one question at a time, right? So we kind of talked about, again, like that's the double idea of the double barrel question, right? Only ask one question at a time on one issue at a time. Again, writing effective questions. So again, some things to think about, right? Ethics. The goal is to measure what people actually think rather than what we'd like them to think, right? I don't want to know what I think you or what I would want you to think. I want to know the truth, right? If I'm surveying, I want to know the truth. I don't want you to give me the answer I want. I want to know what your actual feelings are or your actual opinions are. Writing demographic questions, right? So again, if we are looking for those demographic types of data, right? Age, gender, orientation, race, income level, right? Think about, do we really need this information? If not, people might feel overwhelmed. They might feel a little uncomfortable, right? Why am I asking, or why am I putting all of this personal information down when you want me to just do a survey on how my stay was, right? What does my gender or my race have to do with that? Cultural bias, right? So when respondents tend to answer surveys in different ways depending on their culture or nationality, right? So again, you might want to be careful of certain cultural biases um, or cultural viewpoints, right? Even just in terms of things that we have in our, or the types of questions that you have or the content. I just as a personal example, I remember there was questions about, there was a question, it wasn't a survey question, it was just a question in general, but it was referencing an eggplant, right? The vegetable. But the person completing the question did not know what an eggplant was, right? So if you think about that, right, you might not have an understanding of what the question's asking. Then randomize the questions, right? Make sure it's random so that you can't kind of get into a rhythm or into a pattern, or maybe even tell other people the questions, things like that. So it's kind of unique for everyone or different for everyone. So there's no kind of patterning going on or things like that. And just as an example, something you can do to practice this, right? Create a 10 question survey that would be given to teenagers with regards to streaming services, right? I want you to write 6 questions that are effective and considered to have minimal bias, and then 4 questions that have lots of bias or that have bias. Right? For the 6 questions that have minimal bias, right? Again, you're trying to reduce as much bias as possible. What bias might still be present, right? What bias might still be found in that question, even though you tried to reduce it? And for the 4 bias questions, suggest an improvement. What could we do? How could we change it to minimize some of the bias? Right. So just do this on your own as an example to get an idea of, again, how we can write good survey questions, how we can write bad survey questions, how we could do this intentionally or unintentionally, things like that. Just so, again, you get an idea of the different terms that we've kind of talked about.